In Pocket, DNA has reused art from older sets in the Cardboard TCG for most of the 1 to 3 diamond cards. In this video, we will cover the 5 card arts that were first released in the 4th generation Stormfront set and discuss how the Pokemon were designed then, as well as how they are different now. We will also talk about how it would look if some of them had their old effects in Pocket, and speculate on the impacts to the game. Please let us know down in the comments if there's anything we missed, and if you think Pocket should bring over some of these effects into the game. Released on November 5th, 2008, Stormfront is the 6th and last main expansion from the Diamond and Pearl era of the Pokemon TCG. This is the last set before the release of the first Platinum set in February of the following year. This set contains several new Pokemon level X, such as Heatran, Dusknoir, and Regigigas. It also contained the secret rare Charmander, Charmeleon, and Charizard, which were reprints of the same Pokemon from the very first set. The first card for today's video is Sumiyoshi Kizuki's Dusclops. In Stormfront, Dusclops was an interesting card with 2 different attacks. The first one, Confuse Ray, dealt 20 damage and confused your opponent's Pokemon for 2 energy, 1 being colorless. The second, Trick Room, for 3 energy with 2 being colorless, dealt 40 damage and either did 20 more damage or healed Dusclops for 20, depending on whether you or your opponent had a stadium card in play, respectively. Dusclops struggled to find a place in the meta dominated by Gallade and Gardevoir. In fact, looking at the 2008 results, 7 of the top 16 decks were Gallade Gardevoir, with half of the remainder being some form of Empoleon Bronzong, and then the last 3 being Blissey-focused decks and 1 lone Glaceon Burrow. Overall, a metagame this centralized doesn't lend itself well to a Pokemon that has a relatively low HP pool and conditional, low damage attacks. However, Dusclops did get an evolution in Generation 4 into Dusknoir. In Stormfront, this line was well represented with 2 different Dusknoirs and a Dusknoir level X. However, this was still not enough. Dusknoir level X wanted to be knocked out to get the full benefit of the Ectoplasm Pokepower, which functionally dealt poison chip damage to your opponent. This was a huge cost as it meant you lost all the investment into Dusknoir and surrendered 2 prize cards just to do something that Pocket's Promo Ekans can do with 1 energy. The regular Dusknoirs weren't much better. The holographic one had functionally the same ability as Dusknoir level X, just instead of it becoming a stadium card, it is instead similar to Glaceon EX, where it applies chip damage every turn. Then, its Darkness Mist attack deals 60 damage plus 20 more if the target has at least 20 damage on it for 2 energy. The other Dusknoir allowed you to draw 2 cards, but not have over 6 cards in your hand in total, and then it also took 20 damage. This played into its first attack, Damage Even, where for 2 energy, you can put the same number of damage Dusknoir has it onto your opponent's Pokemon. Its second attack, Night Spin, for 3 energy, dealt 50 damage, and prevented all effects of attacks done to Dusknoir by Pokemon with 2 or less energy. Overall, these effects were way too conditional and dealt way too little damage to be meaningful. However, interestingly enough, there was a Dusknoir deck floating around at the time. It just used Dusknoir from Diamond and Pearl, as well as Dusclops from the Crystal Guardian set. On occasion, you see the other copy of Dusclops from Stormfront, but it would never be the one that was ported over to Pocket. Overall, Dusclops and Dusknoir were just outclassed by other strategies, and even was outclassed by a card of the same name released in a previous format. In Pocket, Dusclops mostly retained the same attack in terms of damage, just without the conditional part around who has a stadium in play. At the end of the day, it was only ever a stepping stone into Dusknoir for its Shadow Void ability, allowing you to basically full heal one of your Pokemon. Even then, this strategy was quite weak, and rarely included in Psychic decks. And once Celestial Guardians was released with Rare Candy, many lists using this strategy dropped Dusclops entirely for more consistency. Overall, it was forgettable when released, and it remains forgettable to this day. The next 2 cards to discuss are the Drifloon illustrated by Atsuko Nishida and Drifblim illustrated by Hajime Kusijima. In Pocket, the Stormfront Drifloon was released in Spacetime Smackdown, and Drifblim was released in Shining Revelry. In its debut, we were unable to find any decks looking to run this line. Drifloon had 2 attacks, each for 1 energy. The first, Constrict, paralyzed the opponent on a coin flip, and the second, Linear Attack, dealt 10 damage to any target of your choice. This is extremely weak for the meta, and thus it never made its way into any decks. In Spacetime Smackdown, this is much of the same, with the same 50 HP and a unique weakness to the Lightning type, and a singular attack dealing 10 and reducing incoming damage by 20. If it was attached to a bigger basic Pokemon and had high damage reduction, it could have been a useful stall tool akin to Dredagon at the time. but alas, it was just extremely weak. Though, the payoff for these two cards was vastly different in strength. In Stormfront, Drifblim had 3 attacks. The first 2 required no energy, and either recurred a card from the discard pile, or searched 2 basic Pokemon to put on the bench, and then attached an energy to each. It also had no retreat cost, so you could conceptually bring in Drifblim, use a free attack, and then retreat into something more powerful on the follow-up, for functionally no cost. Its third attack was also fairly good, if you already had put an energy on Drifloon. For 2 energy, it dealt 40 damage, then flipped a coin. If you got heads, then the opposing Pokemon was confused and cannot retreat. It is doubtful that this would realistically be used, as the utility in the card was the massive search potential, either in the discard pile or the deck, completely for free. Comparing this to what was released in Shining Revelry is no contest. In Shining Revelry, Drifblim just deals 40 damage for 1 energy, with 90 HP and no retreat cost, which was thematically carried over. Overall, it was a pretty standard stat line for sure, but just not a very good one. The Stormfront Drifloon is very take it or leave it, but the Stormfront Drifblim could be meta overnight if it was released as is. Just ignoring the third attack entirely, being able to grab any card, including a Professor's Research from the discard pile, or searching 2 basic Pokemon for free and attaching an energy for free would be insanely strong, not to mention the ability to swap into them again for free because of the 0 retreat cost. Now this could be a little too much setup for the current metagame with cards like Solgaleo attacking on turn 3 for 120, but the potential combo of Professor's Research into drawing 2 more cards and ramping them cannot be overlooked. Just take a look at Sylveon EX. It is wild to see this Stage 1 consistency feature being potentially overpowered in Pocket, and yet completely overlooked in the paper TCG when it was first released. The next card to look at is Bronzor, illustrated by Miki Tanaka. In Stormfront, Bronzor possessed 2 attacks. The first, for 1 energy, was Gyro Swap, which dealt damage equal to the retreat cost of Bronzor. This could combine with something like Ariados from Mysterious Treasures to increase the damage through its sticky Pokebody. The second attack, Psyshock, dealt 20 damage and paralyzed on a coin flip for 2 colorless energies. Its evolution, Bronzong, released in the same set, had the Pokepower Cycler, which functionally allows you to trade any card for 2 basic energies. In addition, it had 2 attacks. The first one, Strange Spin, dealt 20 damage for 2 energy. If you had the same number of cards as your opponent, it also confused them and dealt an additional 40 damage. This comboed well with Cycler, as you could modulate your hand size by 1 to match your opponent and inflict the extra damage and status condition. Its second attack, Heavy Potential, was an evolution of Bronzor's Gyro Swap. It dealt damage to all of your opponent's Pokemon equal to that Pokemon's retreat cost. So in combination with Ariados, you could deal a bonus 60 damage in total, which is very interesting and quite powerful. These synergies make Bronzong a very novel card from a design standpoint, but it didn't measure up in the meta. It wasn't particularly bad, it was just outclassed by a previous copy of itself. 2 Worlds deck archetypes ran Bronzong in 2008, Napoleon Bronzong and Ampharos Bronzong. However, it was the Majestic Dawn Bronzong, and it was run primarily for 2 reasons. 1, its Cursed Alloy Pokebody applies 10 damage each turn to any of your opponent's Pokemon that had Pokepowers, and Pain Amplifier dealt 10 damage to any of your opponent's Pokemon that has any damage on it for no energy. This allowed these decks to have a solid spread damage to hit built-up benches, with serious chip damage allowing for easy KOs for their partner Pokemon. Overall, while the Bronzong that was carried over into Pocket saw no play, Bronzong as a Pokemon did reach 4th place in the 2008 World Championships on Jimmy O'Brien's team. In Pocket, Bronzor was much less impressive. It was a Metal type this time instead of a Psychic type, and it had only 1 attack dealing 30 damage for 2 energy. Its evolution of Bronzong was much chunkier than its earlier counterpart, clocking it at a hefty 120 HP. It also had only 1 attack of Guard Press, dealing a measly 60 damage and reducing damage taken by 20. These cards have seen no play, especially as the game has released better and better Metal types. If the Stormfront Bronzong had been brought over, this may have been a different story. Imagine if Cycler worked in Pocket, which would be trading a card in hand for 2 energy attachments. That is insanely broken and would make Bronzong an auto-include, as you could ramp 3 energies in a single turn. If Bronzong was Metal type as well, and attached 3 Metal energies, you could easily see Goldengo ramp taking off, with it getting 3 energies immediately and cracking for 150 in 1 turn. It's probably for the best that it wasn't ported over. Illustrated by Atsuku Nishida, Starly and Stormfront was clearly templated to answer a lot of what the meta had to offer. It just failed to do so convincingly. It had 2 attacks, both for 1 energy. The first, Sand Attack, made it so your opponent had to flip a coin to attack, and the second, Double Stab, flipped 2 coins to deal 10 damage per each heads. Generally speaking, coin flip cards are not very good. Its evolution of Staravia was more aggressive, with 2 attacks, one being Wing Attack, dealing 30 damage for 2 energy, and the second, Shot Air, dealing 20 with 30 dealt to a bench Pokemon of your choice. Though the evolution to Staraptor brings us back to Starly's design. It had 2 attacks and 1 Pokebody. Its Pokebody of Protect Wing reduces damage done by a Stage 2 Pokemon to your Pokemon. Its first attack, Strong Breeze, effectively shuffles one of your opponent's bench Pokemon back into the deck on a coin flip for 1 energy. This would be devastating into a Stage 2 Pokemon, such as Gardevoir or Gallade, with several energy attached. Its second attack, Clutch, locks in place your opponent's active Pokemon and deals 30 damage for 3 energy. Overall, Starly and Staraptor act as stun and stall cards, while Staravia is much more aggressive with its damage. While the payoff is solid for Staraptor, it is difficult to get the full benefit of Strong Breeze, because it is coin flip based. And while Protect Wing does reduce damage dealt by the major players in the format such as Empoleon, Gardevoir, and Gallade, it isn't really enough to matter in the long run. In Pocket, Starly was generally forgotten. It had 1 attack, Pluck, dealing 20 damage for 1 energy, and discarding Pokemon tools from the target. Its evolution, Staravia, doubled the damage and energy cost to 2 energies for 40 damage. And then Staraptor drew inspiration from Stormfront Staraptor and had 1 attack called Clutch, dealing 80 damage for 3 energy and preventing your target from retreating. However, this still results in the same effect of really not doing enough to matter, and leaving Staraptor open to revenge killing by much of the metagame. The Starly line saw marginally more play once the supporter Berry was introduced. Berry reduces the attack cost of Snorlax, Heracross, and Staraptor by 2 colorless energy. It's not a very good card, and would have been better if it simply added 2 energy to this assortment of 2 Diamond Pokemon. The reason these 3 are selected for Berry is because they are the 3 non-conditional Pokemon on his team in the Diamond and Pearl games. The other 3, Roserade, Rapidash, Floatzel, or Infernape, Torterra, and Empoleon, are dependent on the starter choice of the player. Clearly, Berry is supposed to facilitate a budget deck for this set, similar to the supporter Blaine in Genetic Apex. Unfortunately, while there's been some experimenting with Berry alongside Staraptor, it really hasn't broken out in the open, and has since been replaced in consideration by faster bird Pokemon, like Toucanon, that can abuse rare candy. Overall, across the 5 Pokemon we covered in today's video, none of them were top cards either in their debut or in Pokemon Pocket. However, each of them or their evolutions would have game-changing potential had they been slotted over 1 for 1. This just goes to show how much more limited and simplified the Pokemon Pocket metagame is compared to the paper TCG, even as we have seen more HP and damage numbers increase from the very first set of the game a decade prior to the release of Stormfront. This leaves a ton of design space for DNA and the Pokemon Company to continue to iterate and draw inspiration, which, as we can see with the examples from Staraptor, they seem to already be doing. If you liked today's video, please leave a like and subscribe, and check out our other videos, such as our video rating the cards in the Genetic Apex format, or our video on the design philosophy in EV Grove.